My stepfather read my mother's eulogy out of a spiral notebook and held it up so 200 people could see her handwriting. He said it was in her own words. 3 weeks later I found that notebook in her sewing room. Every page in it is a grocery list. I'm 39. I'm a dialysis nurse in Tampa, going on 14 years at the same clinic, 3 12-hour shifts a week plus whatever they beg me to pick up. Divorced, no kids, one very expensive cat. My mother was Adelina. She was 67. She came here from Puerto Rico with my grandmother in 1968 when she was 11. And she spent 31 years as a school cafeteria manager in Hillsborough County. And she made a flan that people would drive across the state for. She died on the 14th of October at home of pulmonary fibrosis, after 2 years and 2 months of getting slowly worse in a way that everybody could see coming and nobody could do anything about. My father died in 2009, heart fast, in a parking lot. My mother was alone for 5 years and then she met Gil. Gil is 68. He's a retired claims adjuster. Worked for an insurance company in Brandon for 26 years. And he's a smooth, pleasant, well-liked man who remembers your kids' names. They got married in 2014, which makes it 11 years, and I want to be honest that I liked him for the first 6 or 7. He fixed things around her house. He took her to Savannah for her 60th. He learned to make coffee the way she liked it, which is a genuine act of love if you've ever met a Puerto Rican woman about coffee. My mother laughed more with him than she had since my father died, and I was grateful for that, and I still am. And that's the part that makes all of this so hard to explain to people. Here's the first thing I noticed and let go, and it's so small I'm embarrassed. Christmas 2019. Gil gave a toast. It was warm, it was funny, and in the middle of it he said, and of course Marisol, who's built such an independent life for herself over in Tampa. Tampa is 51 minutes from that house. I made the drive that morning. Independent life. That's the phrase. He used a version of it for 6 years. Independent, busy, has her own thing going. Every single time, in a room, in front of people, in a voice that sounded like a compliment. And every single time it landed on me as a little piece of distance, being installed between me and my mother in front of witnesses. I never said anything, because what do you say? He complimented me. Second thing. The house. My mother's house is a 3-bedroom on a corner lot in Plant City. My parents bought it in 1994 for $81,000. Paid it off in 2011, 2 years after my father died with his life insurance. It's her house. My father's name was on it, and then it was hers alone. And Gil moved into it in 2014 and never put $1 into the mortgage because there wasn't one. Around 2021 he started saying, our house. Which, fine. 11 years, he lives there, of course he says our house, but he also started saying, at family things, we put a new roof on the house last year. He did not put a new roof on that house. My mother did with her own money. And I know because I sat with her at that kitchen table while she wrote the check for $9,400 and complained about it. Small. Let it go. Third thing, and this is the one I should have understood. In 2022, my mother got her diagnosis, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It's a fibrosis of the lung tissue, it does not get better, and the doctor was straightforward with us about the timeline. And I started going every Sunday, 51 minutes each way, every Sunday, for 2 years and 2 months. I have the mileage in an app because I'm the kind of person who tracks mileage. 104 Sundays, I did her pillboxes. I took her to 19 pulmonology appointments in Tampa because the good specialist was at my hospital. I sat with her through 6 oxygen adjustments. In the last 8 months I was doing her showers. And in 2023 Gil started leaving on Sundays, not dramatically. He'd say you girls have your time, and he'd go golfing or to his brother's, and he'd come back around 4. Every Sunday. And at the time I thought it was thoughtful, I really did. I thought that man is giving us space. It took me until March of this year to understand that a man who leaves the house for 6 hours every Sunday for 2 years is a man making sure that the only person who ever sees his wife alone is a person who isn't there Monday through Saturday. Now, the escalations, and there are 3 that matter. The first was in the spring of 2024. I was in the kitchen doing her pills and Gil came in and said, out of nowhere, your mom's been talking about the house, about getting things in order. And then he said, she wants to make sure I'm taken care of. You know how she is. And I said, sure, of course. And he said, you'd tell me if you thought she wasn't thinking straight, right? I want you to sit with that sentence, because it took me a year to hear it correctly. He wasn't asking me a question. He was planting a flag. He was establishing, 18 months early, that there might be a question about my mother's thinking. Second escalation, August of 2024. My mother's oxygen requirement went up and she got confused for about 2 days. Hypoxia does that, it's extremely common. It resolved completely when they adjusted her flow rate. And Gil told his sister Bernadette, and Bernadette told my cousin. And by the time it got back to me, the version was that Adelina wasn't really herself anymore and didn't always know what she was signing. I called him on that one. Actually called him. I said, Gil, she was hypoxic for 2 days in August, she's completely oriented. I'm a nurse and I see her every week. And he said, and this is verbatim, I wrote it down that night. He said, Marisol, honey, you see her on Sundays. I see her at 3 in the morning. I had no answer to that. That's the perfect sentence. It's unfalsifiable and it sounds like devotion, third escalation, and this is the one where I almost blew the whole thing up in January of this year. My mother was in the hospital for 4 days with a respiratory infection. I was there every night after shift. And on the second night in the hallway, Gil said, "I've been thinking. When this is over, I might do a reverse mortgage on the house. Get some cash out, she'd want me comfortable." She was upstairs on 4 liters of oxygen and he was in a hallway talking about pulling money out of her house. I said, "Gil, that's not really something to think about right now," and he said, you're right. I'm just tired." And then he squeezed my shoulder and said, "You're a good daughter, Marisol, even from a distance." Even from a distance, in a hospital hallway. At 11 at night on my 4th consecutive day there, I went out to the parking garage and sat in my car and screamed. One time with my mouth closed, which is a thing I do. The last 4 months of her life, my mother changed. I want to describe this carefully because it becomes important and because at the time I read it completely wrong. Starting around June, she got quiet with me. Not cold. Quiet. She'd been a woman who talked constantly. About the neighbors, about her old cafeteria staff, about a woman at church who was rude about the flowers in 2016. And in those last months she'd sit in that chair with her oxygen and just look out the window while I did her feet. And twice, she started to say something and stopped. The first time was in July. She said, "Mari, if something." And then Gil came in from the garage and she said, "Nothing, Mija." The second time was in September, about 5 weeks before she died. She said, "You know your father put my name on everything." And I said, "Yes, Mommy, I know." And she said, "I want you to remember that." I said, "Okay." And I thought she was being sentimental. I thought she was a dying woman thinking about my father. She wasn't. She was leaving me a message and I heard it as sentiment and I will carry that for the rest of my life. She died on the 14th of October at 4 in the afternoon, in her own bed with me on one side and Gil on the other. That part was good. I need to say that. She had a good death and Gil was there and he cried and I don't think that was fake. The funeral was the 19th, at a church on Alexander Street. 200 and some people. My mother knew everybody in that town, and in the middle of the service Gil got up. He had a spiral notebook, a regular one, the kind you buy at Publix for $1.79 with a bent cover, and he said, "Adelina wrote some things down in her last months, and I want to read you her own words." And he held it up. He turned it toward the congregation and held it up so people could see the handwriting on the page. That loopy slanted script. And there was this sound in the room, this collective little intake of breath. Then he read for about 6 minutes. I'm not going to reproduce it. I've read the actual text of it more times than is healthy, because he printed copies for people afterward, which is its own thing. But here's what was in it. It thanked Gil by name 4 times. It called him the great gift of my later years. It said, and I'm quoting this one because I have it in front of me, "I want everyone to know that Gil should stay in our home for as long as he wants it, because it was ours together." It described me as my Marisol, who found her own path far from home. Far from home. 51 minutes. And it ended by asking the family not to fight about things, because things are only things. 200 people wept. My mother's sister sobbed audibly. 3 different women hugged Gil in the receiving line and told him it was the most beautiful thing they'd ever heard. And I sat in the front row in a black dress and felt something go completely quiet in my chest, because here's the thing I couldn't say out loud in a church. My mother's English was excellent. She came here at 11. But her writing had a specific rhythm to it. She wrote the way she talked, short, direct, a little abrupt, and she used "and" instead of commas constantly. I have 30 years of birthday cards from that woman. She would never in her life have written the phrase "the great gift of my later years." That is not a sentence my mother would think, let alone write. I said nothing. I stood in that receiving line for 90 minutes and shook 200 hands and let people tell me how lucky my mother was. 3 weeks later, on the 9th of November, I went to the house to start on her sewing room, because Gil had texted me, asking when I was going to deal with her things. Her sewing room is the back bedroom, Bernina machine, 4 bins of fabric, and a little desk with 3 drawers. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of patterns, was the notebook, same one. $1.79. Bent cover, I recognized it instantly because I'd been staring at it for 6 minutes in a church. I opened it in the middle, grocery list. Cafe Bustelo sofrito platanos chicken thighs, the paper towels she liked. I flipped forward. Grocery list, backward. Grocery list. A phone number for a plumber. Grocery list. A note about a birthday. Grocery list. I went through that entire notebook page by page standing up in that room, and there was not one word of that eulogy in it anywhere, and the handwriting in the grocery lists. My mother's actual handwriting, from a woman on oxygen, in the last year of her life, is shaky. It slants down at the end of lines. Her L's collapsed. The pages he read from in that church were smooth and even and perfectly level. I sat down on the floor of my mother's sewing room with that notebook in my lap, and I did not cry. I got extremely cold and extremely organized, which is what I do at work when somebody's blood pressure drops, and I took my phone out and I photographed every single page, 91 photographs. Time-stamped, the 9th of November, 4:40 in the afternoon. Then I put the notebook in my purse and I walked out through the living room where my stepfather was watching golf and I said, "See you at the reading." And he said, "Drive safe, honey." A lot of people ask why I didn't confront him standing right there in that living room. Honestly? Because I've watched that man work a room for 11 years, and I knew exactly what would happen. He'd have said I was grieving. He'd have said it with sympathy. And then he'd have called 4 relatives before I got to the interstate. So I did nothing for 11 days and I let the family process me instead, which they were already doing. Because here's what I hadn't known during the funeral. Gil had spent the previous 3 weeks distributing that eulogy. He'd printed it, actual copies, on nice paper, and handed them out at the repast and then mailed some. My Aunt Nilda has one on her refrigerator. My cousin Damaris read it at her prayer group, so by November that document wasn't a eulogy anymore. It was the official record. It was what my mother wanted, in her own words, witnessed by 200 people. And it said Gil stays in the house. The first call came from Bernadette, Gil's sister, on the 12th. She said, "I just want to say, whatever happens with the house, I hope everybody remembers what Adelina asked for." I said, "What do you mean whatever happens?" And she said, "Well, Gil's just concerned. He's 68. He doesn't have anywhere to go. Gil has a condo in Brandon that he's rented out since 2015. I have known this for a decade." I said that to Bernadette and she said, "That's his son's now, basically." Then my Aunt Nilda, my mother's older sister 71, called me on the 14th. Nilda raised me half the time. Nilda is the person in that family I love most after my mother. And she said, "Mija, I want to talk to you about the house before the lawyers." And I said, "Okay." And my aunt said, "Your mother said what she said. It's in her own words, honey. You have to honor that." I said, "Titi, do you have a copy of that thing?" And she said, "It's on my refrigerator." Then, and I want to be clear that she said this out of love, she said, "Don't be the daughter who fights over a house. Your mother asked for that specifically." That's when I understood what he'd built. He hadn't stolen anything yet. He'd manufactured a document, read it in a church with a notebook held over his head as a prop, and gotten 200 people, including my mother's own sister, to enforce it for him. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened in those 11 days, because it's the thing that changed how I approached all of it. On the 17th, going back through my phone looking for something else entirely, I found a video from Mother's Day of 2024. 41 seconds. My mother in her chair, cannula in, telling me the platanos I'd brought were too green. And in the corner of that video, on the little table beside her chair, is the notebook, bent cover, $79. That notebook lived on the table next to her chair. It wasn't in a drawer, it wasn't hidden. It was the pad she used for grocery lists in the living room where she spent 18 hours a day. Which meant Gil had had access to it every single day for years, and had known exactly what was in it, and had chosen it specifically because it was hers, and it was full of her real handwriting. And nobody was ever going to open it. Except he'd forgotten to take it back after the funeral. He'd put it back in the sewing room because he was cleaning up. And then 3 weeks later he texted the daughter to come deal with her mother's things. The reading was the 20th of November at 11 in the morning. At an office on Reynolds Street in Plant City. My mother's attorney is a woman named Frances Okonkwo who did her will in 2016 and an update in 2022. Rome had 6 people. Me, Gil, Bernadette, my Aunt Nilda, my cousin Damaris, and Gil's son Trey, 41, who I had met exactly 4 times in 11 years and who drove down from Ocala for this. Frances started reading. It's a short will. The house on the corner lot goes to me. A savings account, split, personal property to me, and a life estate provision. Gil has the right to live in the house for 1 year after her death. And then it's mine, free and clear, 1 year. That's what my mother actually wrote in 2016 and confirmed in 2022, and Gil said, immediately, before Frances even finished the paragraph, "That's the old one." She changed her mind. Everybody heard her say it. Frances said, "This is the executed will. There's no later instrument on file." And Bernadette said, "But she wrote it down." At the end, we all heard it read. And Gil reached into a folder and pulled out a printed copy of the eulogy and put it on that conference table and said, "This is her wish," in her own handwriting. 200 people were there. And Frances, and I love this woman, said very carefully, "Mr. Delgado, a handwritten document can potentially be considered as a holographic instrument in Florida under certain circumstances, but it would need to be examined." And Gil said, "It's at home, I can bring the original." And I said, "No, you can't." And I reached into my bag and I put the spiral notebook on that table, open face up, to a page in the middle, Café Bustelo, sofrito, platanos, chicken thighs, and I said, "This is the notebook he read from at her funeral. I found it in her sewing room 3 weeks ago. Turn to any page you want." Nobody moved for about 4 seconds. Then my Aunt Nilda reached out and turned 3 pages. Then 4 more. Then she went back to the front. And Nilda said, in Spanish very quietly, "Ay Dios mío." And Gil said, "That's a different notebook." And I said, "It's a $79 notebook with a bent cover that lived on the table next to her chair. I have a video of it from Mother's Day." "You want to see it?" he said. "Marisol, you are grieving." There it was, right on time. And Francis Okonkwo, who had been silent for about 90 seconds, said, "Mr. Delgado, I'm going to stop this meeting. I've rewritten this next part 4 times because it's the part where the story stopped being about a house. That night I couldn't sleep and I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook again, going through it a second time, slower, because Francis had asked me to inventory it properly. And I got to the back. You know how you flip a spiral notebook over and start from the other end? People do that. My mother did that her whole life. She'd start the shopping lists at the front and use the back for other things. There were 11 pages written from the back, and the handwriting is nothing like the eulogy. It's shaky, it slants down, the L's collapse. It's a woman writing with fingertips that aren't getting enough oxygen, and I've seen 1,000 patients' handwriting look exactly like that. It's dated entries. Not every day. Maybe 40 entries across the last 4 months of her life, starting the 11th of June. She wrote in Spanish, mostly, with English words dropped in the way she always did. I'm going to give you the shape of it and only a few lines because it's hers, they're records. That's what they are. Short, dry, dated records of what Gil said to her when nobody else was in the house. The 11th of June, he asked about the deed again. The 23rd of June, he says Marisol has her own life and won't want the house. The 2nd of July, he asked about the deed again. I told him it's for my daughter. He was quiet all day. The 19th of July, he brought papers from the bank. I said no. He said I'm confused. The 4th of August, he told Bernadette I don't remember things, I remember everything. That one is underlined. Twice. In her handwriting. The phrase he asked about the deed again appears 6 times across those 11 pages. 6. And the last entry, the 2nd of October, 12 days before she died, is 4 words long, and it's in English, and it says, Mari, check the back. Check the back, she wrote it to me. She knew he'd get to the front of that notebook, or that somebody would, and she put the message where a man who was only ever looking for grocery lists would never turn. And in July, I went back and matched the dates. In July, when she started to say Mari, if something, and stopped when he came in from the garage, that was the 19th. The day he brought papers from the bank, she was trying to tell me. Twice she tried to tell me and I didn't ask a second question either time. I called Francis Okonkwo at 8 the next morning, and I read her the entries over the phone and she was quiet for a long time and then she said, Marisol, do not let that notebook out of your possession. Photograph everything again. I want a forensic document examiner on this before Christmas. Here's what happened over the next 5 months, and I'll go in order. Francis brought in a document examiner out of Orlando. $2,200, which I paid and which was the best money I have ever spent. He compared the eulogy pages. Gil had, incredibly, kept the original sheets he read from, loose, and produced them because he still thought they helped him. Against the notebook's grocery lists, against the back entries, and against about 40 samples of my mother's writing I collected from cards, recipe cards, and a church directory she'd filled out in 2019. His report is 9 pages. The conclusion is that the eulogy text was, with a high degree of probability, not written by the same hand as the known samples, and it identifies 4 specific letter formations that don't match, including her capital A, which she made in a distinctive way her whole life. It also notes that the eulogy pages show evidence of tracing or careful copying, slow, deliberate pen movement, uneven pressure, hesitation marks at letter joins. He traced it. My stepfather sat at my mother's table and traced her handwriting. Second thing. The back entries went to a different professional. Francis brought in an elder law attorney named Doug Prentice as co-counsel. Because what was in those 11 pages wasn't an inheritance dispute. Repeated pressure on an elderly, terminally ill, oxygen-dependent woman to transfer real property, plus a documented attempt to characterize her as incompetent to third parties, is exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Florida law. Doug filed a report with the Department of Children and Families Adult Protective Services Division in December. He was honest with me. With the victim deceased, criminal charges were extremely unlikely, and none were ever filed. But that report existed, and it went in the civil file. And that changed everything about what happened next. Third, and this is the one that actually ended it. Francis filed a petition to terminate this life estate provision. Florida has a slayer statute and it has other doctrines, but what she used was simpler than that. She argued that a beneficiary who attempts to procure a testamentary instrument by fraud, by fabricating a document purporting to be the decedent's writing and presenting it to the estate, has engaged in conduct that goes to the heart of that provision, and she asked the court to strip it. Gil hired his own lawyer in January. That lawyer withdrew in March. I don't know why and I don't need to. He signed a settlement on the 11th of April. He vacated the house by the 30th of May, 7 months early, and waived any claim to the estate. He got the personal items my mother had specifically left him in the actual will, which was his own recliner, a watch, and about $4,000 from the savings account. And he got to not have a fraud finding entered against him by name. I let him have that last part. Francis thought I was crazy. I did it because a fight would have taken another 18 months, and because that house is my mother's house, and I wanted to be standing in it before the anniversary. The family took longer than the courts. Aunt Nilda called me the day after the reading, at 7 in the morning, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She had taken that eulogy off her refrigerator and put it through the shredder at the church office. In January, I let her read the back pages. All 11. She sat at my kitchen table and read her little sister's handwriting for about 40 minutes, and then she said, "She never told me. In 60 years she told me everything and she never told me this." And I said, "Titi, she didn't tell me either." And Nilda said, "She told the notebook. Bernadette has not spoken to me and won't." Her position delivered to Nilda in February is that an old man was scared of being homeless and the family destroyed him for it. She has never once addressed the handwriting. Trey Gill's son sent me a message in June. 2 lines. He said, "I didn't know what he was doing. For what it's worth, I believe you." I answered with a thumbs up, and that's all he's getting. Demerits, my cousin, apologized. She'd read that thing at her prayer group. She cried more about that than seemed proportional, and I told her it wasn't her fault. And I meant it, because the whole design of what he did was to make good people carry it for him. And here's where I am now. I've been in my mother's house since June. I kept her chair. I kept the little table next to it. The notebook is in a fireproof box with the will and the examiner's report. I've thought about framing that last page. Mari, check the back, and I can't do it. It's not a decoration. It's the last thing my mother ever said to me, and she said it in a spiral notebook because a man had made her afraid to say it out loud in her own living room. That's the part that gets me at 2 in the morning. Not the house, not the money. My mother spent the last 4 months of her life keeping a secret log of her own husband, in her own home, on oxygen, at 67 years old, and she never once called me and said, "Come get me." She wrote it down instead. And then she waited to see if I'd find it. I go back and forth on whether that's the saddest thing in this story or the strongest. My aunt says it's the strongest. Nilda says her sister knew exactly what she was doing, that she couldn't prove anything while she was alive, that no one would have believed a dying woman over a charming man, and that she built the only evidence she could build and put it where the person who loved her would eventually look. I don't know. I think she was scared. I think both things can be true. One more thing. When we cleaned out the house, in the closet of the sewing room, there was a shoebox with 31 years of cards from me. Every birthday card, every Mother's Day card, since I was 8 years old and could write my name. Not one of them says anything like the great gift of my later years. They say things like, "Mommy, I love you and I will call you Sunday." So here's what I want to ask, because Bernadette tells anyone who'll listen that I evicted a grieving 68-year-old man, and my aunt and I still argue about the second one. Was I wrong to let him settle without a fraud finding on the record, when he'll go on being a well-liked man in that town? And the one I actually can't put down, my mother wrote, "He asked about the deed again, 6 times in 4 months and never once picked up the phone." Do I have any right to be angry at her for that? Or is being angry at her the last thing he gets to take from me?